Story 1. The Archive of the Unmade. The moment Elias first saw the directory, a shard of pure electric wrongness pierced his usually sterile focus. He was a digital archaeologist, a man who excavated the dead zones of the internet for forgotten history, old GeoCities sites, dead forums, beta versions of defunct operating systems. The job was dull, meticulous, but safe. Until now. The directory was titled Project_. It sat on a server that, by all metrics, should have been purged 30 years ago, belonging to a software company that dissolved in the early 90s after a catastrophic, hushed-up failure. Clicking through the nested folders, all labeled with meaningless alphanumeric strings, felt like disturbing a grave. The data wasn't encrypted, but obfuscated, file extensions deliberately scrambled to prevent conventional access. The air in Elias's apartment, usually crisp from the AC, felt heavy, cold, as if the server's deep freeze had bled into his reality. Finally, he found the content. Thousands of video files, all time-stamped between 1989 and 1991. The resolution was terrible, grainy, a sickly green and amber palette. They weren't security footage or corporate memos. They were records of places that almost existed. The first video Elias played showed a suburban street, familiar yet fundamentally skewed. The houses were correct. Colonial revival, red brick, but the spacing was wrong, the shadows too long, and every window was inexplicably covered in an opaque, milky film. The sound was the most disturbing. A high-frequency, almost ultrasonic whine underneath a distant, indistinct traffic noise that never quite resolved into the sound of actual cars. He spent 4 days locked in his apartment, fueled by coffee and a mounting, almost religious fear, meticulously cataloging the clips. The files weren't random. They formed a cohesive, terrible catalog of a world built from the leftovers of our own, a collection of architectural concepts, failed infrastructure, and discarded ideas. A shopping mall where the escalator always stopped a foot short of the next floor. A railway station where the tracks vanished into a solid concrete wall. An entire town, identical to his own hometown of Reading, but where the town hall was a windowless black monolith, and the statue in the park was dedicated not to a war hero, but to a faceless, rusted geometry. He realized what he was looking at, the archive of the unmade. The digital blueprints, the forgotten renders, the rejected possibilities. They weren't just data, they were ghosts of potential reality, somehow captured and given a terrible, silent life on this archaic server. The dread began to set in when he noticed the anomalies. In the initial clips, the spaces were truly empty. But around timestamp June 14, 1990, a figure appeared. Always on the periphery. Always indistinct. A smudge in the grainy texture of the footage, standing at the end of the never-ending railway line, or just visible through the clouded glass of the suburban windows. It wasn't human. It was a long, thin verticality, darker than the shadows it stood in, like an optical error given sentience. Elias named it the placeholder. One video, labeled resume_Reading_901103, changed everything. It was a close-up of a familiar street corner, one Elias passed every day. And there, standing precisely where the bus shelter was in his reality, was the placeholder. It was clearer now, a towering, starved silhouette. And as the camera, which seemed to be moving, holding a shaky first-person perspective, slowly zoomed in, the placeholder didn't move. But its head, if it had one, snapped to look directly at the lens. The ultrasonic whine in the audio track spiked, becoming a shriek of pure digital distortion, and in the space of that second, Elias's computer screen didn't just display the image. It radiated a cold, foul wind that smelled of ozone and damp basement concrete. He recoiled, knocking his chair back. He slammed his laptop shut. When he opened it again, the file was gone. Not deleted, but simply not there. The archive was fighting back. He knew then that the unmade wasn't just observing, it was learning the pathways to reality. The next 3 days were a descent into paranoid hypervigilance. Elias stopped sleeping. He checked his windows, his doors, his reflection, afraid the placeholder might manifest from the unmade version of his bedroom closet. He knew he had to delete the archive, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy the evidence. It was a terrifying glimpse behind the veil of reality, and the digital archaeologist in him craved the final answer. He located the server's physical address, an abandoned industrial park in rural upstate New York, miles from civilization. He packed a bag, bought a one-way train ticket, and drove the final leg in a rental car, feeling less like an investigator and more like a sacrificial lamb walking willingly to the altar. The building was an imposing, brutalist structure, sealed with rusted industrial padlocks. The power grid was dead, the silence complete. He found a partially collapsed service tunnel, smelling of mold and forgotten copper, and crawled through. Inside, the complex was a labyrinth of echoing, dust-choked offices. The air was colder here, almost painfully so. Following a decades-old wiring diagram he'd found in the archive's metadata, he found the server room. It was not a typical data center. It was a small, reinforced vault, and at its center, encased in a massive humming metal frame, sat a single archaic mainframe, Project Nightlight. It wasn't just running, it was vibrating. The only light came from the dancing green terminal displays, illuminating the dust motes in the freezing air like malevolent stars. The hum was the same high-frequency whine from the videos, amplified, resonating in his chest cavity. He found a maintenance terminal and began the difficult process of accessing the root directory. As he typed the purge command, the temperature in the room plummeted further. He could see his breath. Then the video files began to play, not on the screen, but projected onto the dust motes in the air, a silent, flickering kaleidoscope of unmade streets and impossible buildings swirling around him. The archive was resisting the deletion. The humming intensified, and Elias felt a crushing pressure on his eardrums. He looked up, and on the mainframe's primary display, a new file was rapidly generating itself, the size increasing by the megabyte. Elias_reading_final_draft. The file name was terrifying, a final, personalized threat. This wasn't an archive of the past, it was a template for the future. Suddenly, the mainframe's casing began to distort. The thick metal seemed to ripple and flex, a slow-motion scream of industrial alloy. From the darkest corner of the server room, where the air was blackest, the placeholder materialized. Not as a smear of light, but as an absolute absence of light. A column of pure deep space shadow 30 feet tall, its form defined by impossible geometry that seemed to defy the rules of space and time. It moved without seeming to step, gliding across the concrete floor. The silence returned, but it was a silence heavier than any sound. The placeholder stopped directly in front of Elias. The mainframe screen behind it flickered, and the final_draft file completed. Elias couldn't move. He looked into the placeholder's empty space and he saw it, not a creature but a doorway. A gateway to the liminal world of the unmade. He felt his consciousness being pulled, his reality unzipping at the seams. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, he slammed his hand down on the power-off button for the entire facility. The humming died. The screen went black. The placeholder did not vanish but froze, a monument of pure darkness. Elias collapsed, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs. He crawled out of the complex as fast as he could. He never looked back. But the fear did not end. 2 weeks later, back in Reading, his house was exactly as he left it. But the bus shelter on the corner was gone. The cement pad was there, the signpost was there, but the shelter itself was not. It was just a small, impossible gap in reality. He tried to tell people, but they only said, "What bus shelter? There's never been one there." The archive of the Unmade had not been deleted. It had merely been uploaded, and a small, persistent fragment of the Unmade had taken root in his reality. And every night, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear that faint, high-frequency whine, the sound of his world being slowly, deliberately overwritten. Story 2, The Whispering Field of Black Pines. The Black Pines Forest had always been an exclusion zone on the maps of the Pacific Northwest. Not a park, not a reserve, but an exclusion zone, marked by a double-dashed line and the ominous, italicized phrase, "Access prohibited, hazardous geothermal activity." But geothermal activity wasn't why the logging companies bypassed it, nor why the locals called it the Whispering Field. The reason was simpler, darker. People went in and they never came out. Not even their bones. Leo, an obsessive cartographer and amateur cryptographer, found the key in a forgotten surveyor's journal from 1904. The journal spoke not of vents or steam, but of the pattern, a complex, non-Euclidean arrangement of stone cairns and ancient, impossibly black pines that marked the territory of something that demanded tribute. Leo saw it not as a hazard but as a riddle, a geoglyph of terrifying scale. He trekked for 3 days to reach the perimeter. The transition was immediate and visceral. The familiar smell of damp cedar and earthrot vanished, replaced by a dry, metallic scent, like old blood and ozone. The trees were unlike any he had ever seen, towering, straight-trunked pines, their needles a matte, light-absorbing black, packed so tightly that the ground was perpetually drowned in a charcoal twilight. Sound did not travel well here, it was swallowed by the dense growth, creating an atmosphere of smothering, perfect silence. But the silence was broken not by noise but by whispers. Not words, but the suggestion of words, a sibilant, dry chorus that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the fibers of the wood, the very structure of the forest. It was a million tiny, indistinct voices, always just below the threshold of comprehension, a constant, nagging pressure on the mind. Following the journal's cryptic directions, Leo found the first cairn, a stack of volcanic rock worn smooth by a century of wind and rain, positioned exactly at the apex of a magnetic anomaly. The journal described the purpose of the cairns, the markers of the cycle. There were 12 in total, placed in a perfect, mile-wide pentagram, centered on a massive, clearing-sized granite slab known simply as the mouth. The locals, the journal noted, believed that every 20 years the cycle had to be completed, a ritual of walking the pentagram ending at the mouth, to ensure the thing in the forest remained quiescent. Incomplete cycles led to absorptions. That was the term the journal used for the disappearances. Leo scoffed at the ritualistic nonsense, but the geometric precision was undeniable. He began his survey, charting the pentagram's path with his high-end GPS unit. As he walked, the whispers intensified, weaving themselves into a single, cohesive, malevolent thread. Go back. You are not needed. You are too much. The psychological pressure was immense. He found the second cairn. Then the third. As the sun began to set, painting the top canopy in a brief, blood-orange hue, the blackness within the forest deepened to an impossible shade. The shadows weren't just the absence of light, they were a presence. He reached the fourth marker. The ritual site around it was disturbing. Carved into the base of the tallest black pine was a crude, ancient symbol, a spiraling knot, and at its base not animal bones but human hair, meticulously woven into a flat, dry mat as if used for a blanket. As Leo stood there, he felt a sudden, profound loneliness. Not the normal solitude of the wilderness, but an existential erasure, a terrifying sense that the world had forgotten he existed the moment he crossed the boundary. He looked down at his GPS. The signal was strong, yet the screen displayed a frantic, incomprehensible error message. Location unstable. Referencing null space. He was physically present, but digitally, cartographically, he no longer existed. He was off the map in every sense of the word. The whispers became sharper, closer, and now they seemed to be saying his name. Leo pressed on, driven by a fear that had calcified into a desperate need to finish the pattern. If the ritual kept the forest stable, then finishing the cycle might be his only way out. By the time he reached the 11th cairn, his mind was fracturing. He hadn't slept in 2 days, every moment consumed by the dry, sibilant voices that now sounded like 1,000 iterations of his own voice, mocking his arrogance. He looked at his own hands and for a terrifying second they didn't look like his own. The skin looked thin, stretched, translucent, as if the forest was beginning to absorb the color out of him. He was losing his self, his identity dissolving into the overwhelming presence of the place. He finally stood before the last marker. Beyond it lay the mouth, a massive black granite disc 60 feet in diameter, slightly concave, looking less like a stone and more like the lens of a colossal, buried eye. It was ringed by the 12 largest, oldest black pines, their branches interlocking to form a perfect, starless dome. There were no whispers here. Only a deep, internal hum that vibrated the fillings in his teeth. As he walked onto the granite slab, the air changed again, becoming thick, viscous, like wading through warm oil. He felt a pressure, immense and external, pushing down on his skull. He looked at the granite surface. It wasn't smooth. It was carved with infinite, swirling patterns, not decorative but functional. A massive, interlocking knotwork that seemed to represent a perpetual geometric exchange. Then he saw the recent etchings. Faint, newly carved lines haphazardly intersecting the ancient knotwork. They were letters. Owendoan. Sorry, names. The names of the disappeared, etched into the mouth, confirming their final location. They hadn't vanished. They had become part of the forest's operating system, their identities and consciousness absorbed and recorded. A deep, resonating sound came from beneath the granite, a bass note that shook the soles of his boots. He looked up at the black canopy. The trees were no longer static. They were swaying, not in the wind, but in a slow, rhythmic, impossibly heavy motion. And as they swayed, their branches began to weep a viscous, black sap that steamed slightly in the cold air. The sap dripped onto the granite, sizzling as it hit the stone, forming new, wet lines that snaked into the ancient carvings. Leo understood the ritual now. It wasn't to appease the forest. It was to complete its input. The forest was not a hazard. It was an organism. A massive, patient entity that absorbed everything that touched its perimeter, bodies, memories, identity, and processed it into a stable, whispering equilibrium. The pentagram was a funnel. He felt the drain begin. A cold, surgical suction on his mind, pulling away memories, feelings, the very concept of Leo. He tried to run, but his body moved through the viscous air as if wading through concrete. He collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed against the cold granite. He saw his own face reflected in the wet sap, and his features were already blurring, his eyes widening in a silent, final scream, his identity melting away. He scrabbled for his knife, and in a final, futile act of defiance, he began to carve his own name into the cold, ancient granite of the mouth, Elio. The last thing Leo heard wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, calm, deep voice in his own mind, one word: completed. When the morning sun finally broke through the perpetual twilight, there was nothing left on the granite slab but a fresh, crude carving of the name Elio, surrounded by a small, shallow puddle of black sap. The whispering field of black pines was stable again. The cycle was complete. And now there was a new, faint resonance in the whispers, a quiet, insistent argument about the correct method of surveying an unmappable space. Story 3. The tenant of the six-digit house. The house on Sycamore Lane didn't have a number. It had a cipher. 6 hand-painted digits, 4-0-3-1-2-9, affixed above the porch, but not corresponding to any municipal street index. It was an impossible house, sitting between numbers 401 and 405, a sliver of Victorian Gothic that should not have been there, yet undeniably was. Arthur, a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay, leased it under circumstances he couldn't quite recall. A faded contract, a cash payment, and a landlord whose face was a perfect, sun-drenched blank in his memory. The rent was impossibly cheap, the house impossibly large, and the silence inside was a living thing, heavy and soft, like a footfall on deep pile carpet. The first week was dedicated to documentation. The house was a museum of architectural anxiety. The stairwell made a sharp 90-degree turn halfway up, leading to a perfectly blank wall where a landing should have been. The hallways didn't just feel long. They felt accelerated, distorting perspective so that walking down them gave Arthur vertigo. The most disturbing feature was the basement. It wasn't a basement, it was a vast, cylindrical pit of rough-cut stone, plunging into absolute darkness. The air down there was bone-dry and tasted of old iron and something subtly sweet, like overripe fruit. At the center of the earthen floor stood a single rusted cast-iron chair, bolted to the ground. Arthur never went down, only stood at the threshold, dropping pebbles and timing the echo, always a second too long, suggesting a depth far exceeding the building's known foundation. The second week, the house began to assert its tenancy. Arthur would wake up, and the photographs he'd taken the day before would be subtly altered. A chair moved 3 inches to the left. A shadow in a corner that had been distinct and sharp was now a blurring, indistinct smudge. One morning, a picture of the living room taken in natural light showed a figure standing behind the lace curtain. A tall, thin shape Arthur swore was not there when he shot the picture. The figure wasn't threatening but observant, a permanent resident of the six-digit house. He started to feel a crushing sense of surveillance, not just from the unseen figure but from the house itself. The walls felt thin, not structurally but in the way they separated him from the outside. He felt like he was living inside a colossal, half-closed eye. Then came the muttering. It began in the walls of the master bedroom, a low, rapid, non-stop flow of indistinct, whispered speech. It wasn't a draft or a pipe. It was articulate, patterned noise like 200 people arguing just behind the plaster. It would cease the moment he put his ear to the wall, only to resume the second he pulled away. He recorded it, and on playback the sound was nothing, just static and the sound of his own heavy breathing. It was a sound that existed only in the direct moment of listening, a sonic trap laid by the architecture. His anxiety escalated into a chronic state of fight or flight. He boarded up the single window overlooking Sycamore Lane, not to keep the outside world out, but to keep the house from seeing the outside world. He was alone, but he knew he wasn't. The tenant of the six-digit house was the house itself, and it was slowly, deliberately rewriting the script of his existence. He found a piece of paper on the floor of the hallway, a page torn from a ledger, with only one sentence scrawled on it in hurried black ink. "IT is not for you to know the basement's function." The discovery of the note was a watershed moment. It confirmed Arthur's terrifying suspicion. The house was active, intelligent, and malicious. The muttering in the walls was no longer background noise. It was an escalating, high-tempo, manic conversation, a chorus of internal architectural distress. He realized the 6 digits above the door, 4-0-3-1-2-9, were not an address. They were a countdown. He checked his calendar. The current date, the date he had rented the house, was exactly 6 days ago. The numbers didn't count down days but degrees of decay. He started documenting the decay and the changes were exponential. The wallpaper began to bleed in the shape of complex, repetitive spirals. The dust on the wooden floors formed itself into perfect, unintelligible sigils overnight. The stairwell now took 3 sharp 90-degree turns, leading him into a small, windowless, cold room he was certain had not existed 12 hours prior. The house was growing internally like a cancer. He stopped eating, terrified of taking his eyes off the structure long enough to prepare a meal. His photography became a desperate, obsessive ritual, shooting the same corner every hour, trying to capture the moment of transformation the second the house moved. On the 5th day, or following the house's logic, the 2-digit day, Arthur was forced to the basement. The muttering had coalesced into a single grinding sound of metal on stone, emanating from the depths of the pit. He descended the rough-hewn stone steps, the air growing sweeter, more metallic, the profound silence of the lower atmosphere a vacuum of sound. The cast-iron chair at the center of the floor was now glowing faintly, a dull orange ember in the darkness. On the floor around it, the sweet metallic scent was almost unbearable, and Arthur realized it wasn't old iron, it was old blood dried and desiccated. He stood before the chair, the glow illuminating the dark stone walls. And he saw them, thousands of tiny, precise scratches in the rock, radiating outward from the chair like the spokes of a wheel. They were not random. They were tally marks. Hundreds of thousands of them, each one a record of time, of something held captive or something consumed. The house was a vessel and the chair was its docking station. The metal on stone sound intensified, and he realized it was the sound of the chair rocking gently, rhythmically, as if an invisible weight was shifting in it. Then, from the darkness above, something dropped. It wasn't heavy but it was wet. It landed with a soft splat on the earth floor a foot from his boot. It was a key. A very old, very large brass key. Attached to it was a small tag. Arthur's hand trembled as he picked it up, the brass chilling his skin. The tag was handwritten, the ink faded but still legible. Final lock. Do not turn. He knew it was a test. The house wanted him to go up, to find the final lock and complete the structural transformation. He climbed the stairs, the brass key heavy in his palm, the muttering reaching a hysterical pitch. He found the lock in the attic, a massive iron mechanism, built into a solid oak door that was not there yesterday. The key fit. He stood for a long time, listening to the house scream its desire, his heart beating like a trapped bird against his ribs. He knew if he turned the key, the 6-digit house would become complete, its true form realized, the final seal broken, and Arthur would become the next tally mark on the basement wall. In a final, perverse act of resistance, Arthur did not turn the key. Instead, he slammed it hard into the keyhole, breaking the mechanism. The house immediately ceased its noise. The light vanished. The air went ice-cold. Absolute silence. He waited, sweat pouring off him for the retribution. When he finally opened his eyes, he was no longer in the attic. He was standing on the lawn of a perfectly normal, numbered house, 403 Sycamore Lane. His car was on the curb. His bag was on the porch. The world was solid, real, and sane. The impossible house was gone. He had won. But he hadn't. He drove away, watching his rearview mirror. 2 weeks later, he rented a new apartment far across the city. He checked the address. The number above the door was 8-9-7-0-4-3. 6 digits. When he looked across the street, he saw a sliver of Victorian Gothic, impossibly nestled between 2 normal houses, and above its porch, 6 freshly painted numbers, 8-9-7-0-4-1. The house hadn't vanished. It had merely followed, adapting its cipher. Arthur knew he was not a tenant, he was a host. And the house was counting down again, not to the end of his lease, but to the end of his sanity.